After you've created a project file or project database, you need to put one or more surveys into it because those surveys are what you're going to record data into. So you have a project container, and within the container you have a bunch of individual surveys. Let's create a G864 survey, and we've already created a project. Now, let's create a new survey. Let's start with a name. Let's say we're looking for a buried wellhead, right? Try to name your surveys things that will mean something to you. On the G864, you can pick different numbers of sensors. This will be a single sensor survey. How many samples per second would you like? This is the selection for the G864. For other instruments, the selection will be different. But let's go with the default of 10 samples per second. Now, let's talk about the offset of the sensors from the GPS. If you think about it, when you're recording data, you're getting GPS information out of your GPS. That may be above your back, above your head and behind you, the GPS antenna, and you may have the sensor either up there with it, or you may have the sensor somewhere out in front of you on a staff. So offset left, we'll say that we have the sensor up on the backpack somewhere near the GPS antenna. We'll say it is 30 centimeters or 0.3 meters to the left of the GPS antenna. It's not forward of the GPS antenna at all, and we'll say that it's at the same height as the GPS antenna. So we've defined the location of the sensor relative to the GPS. How will we navigate? We have various choices. GPS navigation simply says that as we survey, we'll record GPS data, and that data will be associated with individual measurements. Marked surveys say that we'll lay out some markers on the ground, or we'll just know what our route will be with a certain geometry, and that the locations of the data will be associated with the with an interpolation between endpoints and marks along a line. We'll get more to what that means later on. And finally, you can have GPS surveys that don't have a pulse per second. Normally, if you say you'll have a GPS survey, the requirement is that the GPS is receiving not just location sentences, but also a very accurate once per second signal that allows us to synchronize the GPS sentences, the location information, with a really specific point in time. This is sort of the default for GPS surveys. No PPS means that we'll get the GPS signal in, but we don't care about the additional accuracy from getting a PPS. If you're doing a large mineral survey, for example, it may not really matter if you're within a second or a half a second accuracy with with your GPS locations, because you're looking for large objects underground. In the case of a UXO survey, you may care about having very accurate locations for any particular measurement. So we'll just say GPS, and we're not going to select a route file. In another video or another presentation, we'll talk about how route files work, and we'll just talk about that in a different presentation. And the swath radius, we will say, will be 2 meters. Now, swath radius is useful for when you're surveying using the MagNav tablet, you'll see a trace of where you've been surveyed, and you can effectively paint the surface that you're walking on with and collecting data on with an indication of where you've surveyed that shows how wide the track is that's approved by whoever designed the survey. And there's a separate video on this subject also. I recommend looking at that because you want to be clear about this. This exists for the sake of managing your actual field work. So we have an existing project called G864 test. We have a new survey name called Buried Wellhead 1. We're going to save that information. Here we are. We can see that information. We can go back in and edit that survey. Let's say we want to call it, change the name to match some other requirement. We'll change the name and we can save it again. And we have the new information there. We could go in and change, samples per second and save. We can do those things, some of these things, only while there's no data in this survey. Later on, you can imagine, for example, that if you've already collected a bunch of data at 20 samples per second, you cannot then come back in and change the sample rate to 10 samples per second. One of the notions of a survey is that the survey technique and parameters are the same throughout the survey. So if you have data already in a survey or in a project file or in a survey, and you try to edit some of these things, numbers of sensors, samples per second, navigation type, you won't be allowed to do that. If, however, you want to change the offset, it could be that you were mistaken when you first started out, or you didn't know what it would be, but you had a consistent setup when you were in the field. Even if you have data already collected into a survey, you can go back and change sensor offset, being careful about it. So that's how you create a survey in Survey Manager. This is a G864 GPS survey. And additional presentations will talk about some other types of surveys.